Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me again on another episode of On My Mind. Sorry, it's a bit dark in here. I'm in a hotel room and the lighting is not the best, but I just thought it's time to put out another video and talk about some of the things that are out there. And so today I want to talk about a bit more general topics, and I hope it's a bit more positive than my last couple of videos where I think I was a bit of a downer. But today I'm going to talk about things that I think are some interesting trends that may not be so good for the industry. Number one, I want to talk about is the increasing amount of cost overruns we are seeing in projects. This is a big worry for me, and we'll come back to that. And the second thing I want to talk about today is actually the growth of FLNG. And FLNG is seen as a bit of a savior, and I'm going to try to talk about whether I think it's a bit we're being overly optimistic, or I think are the positives, well deserved or not. So let's jump right into it. Let's talk about cost. A few years ago, we were all barreling towards, $500 a ton. That was the magic number we all wanted to reach. And the people like Cheniere and some of the early American projects, they achieved that $500 a ton. This is a very misleading number, of course. When you talk about dollars per ton, you basically divide the total capex by the total capacity. Now, what does the capex include? Does it include financing costs? Does it include owners' costs? Does it include marine facilities? These are all kind of the uncertainties in that number, but it does give you a bit of a metric. Much like when you ask a contractor to build a house, they might give you a cost per square foot, kind of a metric to look at. So we use cost per ton. And as I said, back in the turn of the century, we were really looking at $500 being the kind of the ideal project in the US. And some of the new early adopters in the US did achieve that. The Qatari projects at the turn of the century, which were very large trains, were actually achieving numbers better than that. And as far as I know, the record is still being held by Equatorial Guinea back in the 90s when they achieved $200 a ton, which was amazing considering that Equatorial Guinea was a very remote location, had no infrastructure, done by companies which are Marathon, I think, at the time, and they still managed to pull it off and do an amazing project, and the project is still working today. So obviously, it can work at those levels. But now, in the last few years, we have seen a kind of a trend towards accepting much, much, much higher dollars per ton. And of course, that has a direct impact on the economics of a project. And it seems to be it's almost like normal news now that we hear about cost overruns. And these dollars per ton are now getting in the $1,500 to $2,000 range in North America. Plaquemines, for instance, is about $2,000 a ton. Golden Pass is about $2,000 a ton. Plaquemines could be a little bit less than that, but it's still more than $1,000 a ton. Mozambique, of course, that was just in the news. They announced that their costs have gone up significantly, and it's now looking at about a $1,500 per ton. The costs have gone up by $4.5 billion, and Total is asking the government to accept it. The Exxon project in Mozambique, the Rovuma project, I calculate that being as $1,500 a ton. Again, a long way away from the $500 a ton metric that we used to like and think that was achievable. So obviously that's going to have an impact on the bottom line because the capex directly relates to the tolling fee and how much you have to charge to actually process the gas from gas into LNG. My worry is that it's kind of perceived as a victimless kind of a thing. Not a crime, but there's no victims in this. So the costs go up, big deal. The costs get rated over the life of the project, and the customer will pay a little bit more, but hardly anything. It's okay. I think that the victim in all of these cost overruns is actually the local governments and the local citizens. Imagine that most of these projects, especially around the world, they're based on a offshore field that could be a production sharing scheme. In a production sharing scheme, the contractor, which is typically the international oil company, like Exxon or Total or whatever the case might be, gets all its costs, upstream costs, reimbursed by the government. So when the costs go up, it's a time value of money thing. They're going to get the money back from the government. So not a big deal for their point of view. However, it's a huge deal for a poor country like Mozambique because in the end of the day, they are paying for that cost overrun that Total has now said there is. And they have no real control over that. Total says the costs have gone up, and Mozambique says, oh, okay, I guess we have to accept it. Now, what that means is the project profitability gets pushed down. First, Total will potentially, the production sharing contract is designed as such, recover all these overruns, cost increases from the government. So they are not that impacted. The government has to pay out a lot more to pay for this. And of course, the ultimate profitability of the project declines. The break even date of the project gets pushed out. So the date when the government can actually start collecting income taxes gets pushed out. And that causes a serious issue because it really is a situation like we have in Australia, where we had a lot of the LNG projects were built 10 years ago, massive cost overruns, and the government is basically forced to admit today that these projects are not paying any taxes or hardly any taxes. Because in Australia, it's a profit resource sharing scheme. And if the project is not profitable because the costs have gone up, the government doesn't get any income. And so the people don't get any income. So there's a bit of a social issue here that we have had projects in places like Australia and now potentially a place like Mozambique producing LNG, or they will be producing LNG, making good revenues for the companies involved, like Total, who's already recovered their cost. And guess what? There's no profits that are going down to the people. And that, I think, is something that we all should be concerned about. So there is a victim in these cost overruns. And unfortunately, that victim is actually the local people and the people who can least afford it. Mozambique is one of the poorest countries in the world. It needs to start seeing some income from these LNG projects. And unfortunately, when Total kind of says, hey, oh, sorry, guys, it's the way it is, costs have gone up $4 billion, that means that the date that Mozambique is going to start receiving money in taxes gets pushed out by that equivalent amount. And then Total is saying, hey, give us 10-year extension on the field because it takes us more time to recover. Well, that's a bit hokey because I think in a production sharing contract, they would have recovered that, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt. You're actually now stopping anybody else from coming in as well. So it's not like Mozambique can say, okay, we'll take a lost leader with Total, but then later on we'll get some more people to explore and they'll find more gas. In the end of the day, these cost overruns have a massive impact. But my worry is in a place like America, in the US, where costs have gone up dramatically. You know, the Cheniere's of the world, the first Camerons, first Freeport, those projects are $500 a ton, $600 a ton. Now we don't bat an eyelid when we say $1,500 a ton, $2,000 a ton. And if I run the numbers, I just don't see how the tolling fees can work. And if we are really going into an environment where gas price might be soft for a while, you really need, when the projects first come online, to have high prices to kind of pay off early on some of the cost overruns. Well, that may not be the case. And that could be a problem for the financiers and for the project sponsors. So not a great thing. And this is not even talking about the uncertainty with tariffs. You know, the Supreme Court today in America is debating whether tariffs are legal or not. The point is, it's a massive added uncertainty. Who's going to pay for that? Adds to the cost overrun because ultimately the customer will pay. Can the customer afford to pay? If we are really in a place where oil price is going to stay low, so people are going to look and say, well, I can get oil-linked price contracts for much cheaper than buying American gas, which has all these cost overruns. And it's not only in America. The places like in Canada, you know, the Kitimat project has gone 4 times its initial cost estimate for a very small project, you know, less than 2 million tons. That's not good. And I think we all have to kind of rein on where these costs are coming from. Of course, we can say it's labor has gone up, steel's gone up, inflation's gone up. All these things are valid, but are we doing enough to tighten our belts? I'm not so sure we are. So it kind of segues into another topic that I think we're all getting very excited about, which is floating LNG. We have very short memories. Just a decade ago, the Shell Prelude ship was being built. Its cost went up from 5 billion to 10 billion to 15 billion to who knows what, because Shell never told us the final number. But the project only produces some 2 to 3 million tons. If it's really 15 to 20 billion, that's $3,000 a ton. Long way away from $500 a ton, aren't we? So floating LNG initially was, oh my God, it's not so good. It has a lot of risk, and I think it does, because it's obviously you're taking something that's fairly complex, fairly large, and putting it in an offshore environment with all the offshore, influences, the wave motion, the weather, the logistics, the repairs, the space, the safety, a million things to think about. But then the Malaysians came along and they built two smaller ships, simpler ships, and everything was a success. And then we did the conversion, the Healy conversion in Singapore, and that went to Africa, and that's been a success. And then really the big mark of success was ENI's ship in Mozambique, which was a massive success, built by the same shipyard, Samsung, that built the Prelude. That was a disaster. I think it's because Shell probably was overly secretive with technique and they didn't want to get any outside help. While I think ENI was doing much more in a traditional way and getting people to look at it and audit the design, and it's working out amazingly well. So we have 4 or 5 ships. We have another one up in Senegal that just started. So we have, we have the Tango, which has been like a much smaller ship that's been running around. So we have, let's just say, a half a dozen FLNG ships in the world. It's still relatively new. But now, I think prematurely, we're acting like FLNG is no big deal. Let's all do FLNG. And suddenly, every day goes on with another FLNG FID in Argentina. Now there's 2 or 3 in Argentina, Canada, and everybody's acting like FLNG is kind of standard. Of course, there's 2 or 3 projects being proposed in the States. I just remind everybody that it wasn't such a long ago when the Shell Prelude ship was considered an absolute disaster. I don't think we should be nonchalant about the fact that FLNG is technically a lot more complex than onshore LNG. There's a lot less room for error. We are now asking these ships to be built by shipyards that may or not have that experience that they need to do this, and operators that may not have the wherewithal to kind of manage if things don't work out well. And I don't think the bankers and the financiers are taking account of the added risk of something being on a floating ship. Think of it this way: you have a giant refrigerator that's moving, making some a gas to a very, very cold temperature. Now you take that and you shake it with the wave motion and still try to make that temperature work in a safe environment. You're going to have some issues. You're going to have to deal with things. There's not a lot of room for things to kind of, explosion zones. There's not a lot of tanks. If you have rich gas, you don't have a lot of space for your condensate. So now you need a ship that hangs alongside. You need a ship that hangs alongside to store or to offload. You have all the ship to ship transfer risk. I'm not saying cannot be overcome, and they have been overcome. But I think that operators and project sponsors should really ask ourselves, do we need to do floating? Is floating really the best option? Cost wise, I'm not so sure it is anymore. Floating is about $2,000 a ton. Maybe compared to $3,000 a ton, it's a pretty good deal. Compared to the $500 a ton, not so good of a deal. Maybe you have land issues, you can't have rights, and or maybe it's a dangerous area where you really don't want to have workers on the side. Maybe it's a politically unstable, you don't want to put a lot of capital investment. Maybe the field is kind of small and you want to move it. There's a lot of reasons why you might do FLNG, but let's make sure that you also account for all the risk. So, a bit more optimistic note this week. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned a few things. And always, feedback is welcome. Thank you so much.